Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay. Anyone having business before the King's Justice and the Superior Court of Justice, attend now and shall be heard. Long live the King, the Honorable Justice Biden, you may be seated.
Good morning, all.
Good morning.
My sincere apologies, all of you. Unpredictable.
Don't worry. Good morning, Your Honor. Three housekeeping matters. So today, Ontario will be calling its next witness, Mr. Cliff Hamill. And we propose to divide the examination chief between my colleague, Ms. Gaggy, and myself. I've checked with my friends, there's no opposition to this. So the plan is that Ms. Gaggy will take the witness through his background experience and the NCR sections of his evidence. And then I would take him through his response to the economic rents. That's the plan.
Very good.
Also, our colleague Sidra Sabzwari is operating the documents today. She's been part of our team for years, but this is her first in-person attendance, so you may not have seen her face before.
Welcome.
And last housekeeping point before we begin, I went to Walmart last night. I bought 6 USB fans. I tested them all. This is the only quiet one. I've asked Madam Reporter. She says the sound is fine. So I'm going to leave that for any witness who wants to use a fan. It's battery operated, so they can use it without plugging it in.
Very nice.
I wish I bought
Thank
10 of
you.
them.
I have seen before people wearing them around their necks. But,
Oh, on tourist, you mean?
everywhere else.
It's a good idea. Maybe
No,
tomorrow.
at the grocery store.
Oh, even better.
But that is very kind of you. Thank you.
Gonna hand it over to my colleague. Thank you very much.
Your Honor, I've handed up 4 documents to the court reporter. They are 1 qualification statement, 2 reports from Mr. Hamill, the demonstratives, and I've also provided a copy to the court reporter and for yourself.
And before you start, can you tell me if these reports from Mr. Hamill are same as what I would have received some time ago?
They are not. These are revised to redact out any references to the Restool action. They have been provided to my friends and they've seen them and there have been no issues.
And
And
are the redactions visible on the report?
those ones, you've received clean copies, but we also have red line copies that we're happy to provide you with.
Uh, Okay, thank you.
Before the witness is sworn in, I'd like to enter Mr. Hamill's qualifications statement as a numbered exhibit. The parties have agreed to Mr. Hamill's qualifications and admissibility of his reports. We will then enter his reports and demonstratives as exhibits when he is on the stand. Copies of all the exhibits we intend to enter into the record today have already been provided to my friends in both physical and digital copy.
Very nice.
So the document that I'm now looking at is entitled Expert Qualification of Mr. Cliff W. Hamill, an agreement as to the admissibility of his reports. I believe this will be exhibit 55 or 55? 55, thank you. This document says, for the purposes of stage 3 of this case, the parties agree to the expert qualification of Mr. Cliff W. Hamill as follows. By virtue of his training and experience, an expert in the economics of the electricity industry and electricity markets. This applies to the industry in general, as well as the industry as it has existed in Ontario, with a particular emphasis on the generation of electricity from water power, i.e. hydroelectric generation. It applies to evaluating the economic performance of entities in the electricity marketplace, including crown revenues from entities in the Robinson Superior Treaty Territory, the geographic range of markets, including how that has changed over time, and how economic performance might have changed if different water rental rate setting approaches had been considered and adopted. I will,
You seek them to.
yes, Your Honor, I will be taking him through his qualifications, and at the end of those, I will be asking Your Honor to qualify Mr. Hamel based on Exhibit 55. I will also be asking Mr. Hamel whether he waives copyright on his reports. We'd like to now call Mr. Hamel as Ontario's second witness.
My name is Cliff William Hamel, CLIFF, WILLIAM, and HAMAL.
Thank you. Do you solemnly affirm that the evidence to be given by you to the court touching the matters in question between the parties shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the
Yes, I do.
truth? Thank you, Nathan.
Council, I have been asked some temperature reducing things. Some I saw. Try that. Is everybody-
How about that?
It is fine.
Okay.
Mr. Hamel, we're doing our best.
I will-
Everyone's trying as you.
I will do my best to illuminate the issues today.
Good morning, Mr. Hamel. The reports you've prepared in this proceeding are entitled Expert Report of Cliff W. Hamel and Expert Reply Report of Cliff W. Hamel. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Your first report was initially dated June 24, 2002, and was later redacted for references to the Restool action, and it is dated April 17, 2023.
That's right.
And your second report was initially dated December 5th, 2022, and was later redacted for references to the Restool action, and it is dated April 17, 2023.
That's right.
Could you please mark Mr. Hamel's first report as Exhibit 56? And could you please mark Mr. Hamel's reply as Exhibit 58? 57, apologies.
Are you content with the number of exhibits at this time? The reports? Yes.
And do you waive copyright on your reports?
Yes, I do.
You also have work papers for your first report, is that correct?
That's right.
Your Honor, the work papers are found at Exhibit 1, tab 3143.
Okay. Exhibit 56 is the first report. Is that right? Yes. Exhibit 56 then is the or does the first report have a title?
Yes, it does. It's just expert report of Cliff W. Hamel, and the second report is expert reply report of Cliff W. Hamel. And Mr. Hamel, did you prepare the demonstratives we'll be looking at today?
Yes, I did.
And do the contents of your demonstratives reflect your reports?
Yes, they do.
Are there any references outside of your reports?
There are two. One, and I can explain those if you'd like. I make a reference to Professors O'Riordan and Mintz's testimony and reports, just for reference, and as some of the ideas come up. I did not do that in my original report. And the second thing is I deal with Professor Stiglitz's testimony concerning, in a nutshell, 30%, a claim that 30% of economic rents under a certain circumstance go back to the Crown. That number was not in his original report. That's a new element that I address in my demonstratives.
Thank you. And can we have the demonstratives marked as a lettered exhibit for the time being? And then at the end of this examination in chief, we will ask them to be marked as a numbered exhibit.
That would be S.
Exhibit S.
Mr. Hamel, what materials do you have before you?
I brought before me 2 copies of the demonstratives. One of them shrunk down 6 per page so I can find things a little bit easier. And then I have my 2 reports. And then I have 2 more reports. Those are the joint reports by Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings.
Counsel, will you let me know if I should have those reports for me?
Absolutely. There are references in the demonstratives to where you can find certain pieces of information, but of course I will let you know. Can you confirm that you signed a document to abide by Rule 4.1 of the Ontario Rules of Civil Procedure, and that you understand that it is your duty to best assist this court?
Yes, I signed that and I understand that duty.
Okay, we'll start with providing the court with some background about your professional qualifications. I'm turning to Appendix 2 of your first report, which has now been marked as Exhibit 55. And this appendix, Appendix 2 of your first report, has your CV, and we'll also be sharing it on the screen. And this CV, is it up to date and accurate to the best of your knowledge?
Yes.
And can you tell us about your education?
Yes, as shown on the screen, I list the 2 degrees I have, accredited degrees. I have a Bachelor of Science degree from the United States Merchant Marine Academy with a dual major. One of those majors is marine engineering, which relevant to the issues here can be thought of as power systems, how power plants work. The other degree was marine transportation, having to do with the operations of ships, which are less relevant here. Yes. Would you like me to start over?
Whatever you're.
Okay. The other degree is a Master of Science in Industrial Administration from Carnegie Mellon University. That degree is a business degree with heavy emphasis on economics and finance.
Your Bachelor of Science, U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, what is that?
It's the Merchant Marine Academy is a federal military academy similar to West Point or Annapolis, but it's focused on the maritime industry. So I sailed on cargo ships, traveling the world and earning licenses to operate those ships.
I'll jump to the last page of your CV and ask about your professional qualifications. Can you talk to us about those?
I list in the 2 paragraphs here associations that I'm a member of. That includes the Energy Bar Association, the United States Association for Energy Economics, and the International Association for Energy Economics. I also list various qualifications and licenses. They go by slightly different names. I don't think the distinction matters here, but from the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission, I have certified as a senior reactor operator. From the Department of Energy, I was qualified as a nuclear plant engineer and as a nuclear engineer officer of the watch. And then also from the United States Coast Guard, I have licenses as third assistant engineer and third mate. For the most part, those all relate to, with the exception of the third mate license, they all relate to power systems operations having to do with nuclear and fossil generation.
Nuclear power engineer. Can you tell us more about that?
The United States Navy has nuclear prototypes, which are fully operational nuclear power plants that would exist on submarines and aircraft carriers. They have some in various locations on dry land, including upstate New York. I worked there and received certification to operate those plants. And we would start those plants up and shut them down daily and teach Navy nuclear personnel how to operate those plants before they shipped out overseas. There's very limited room on a submarine for people in training. So they do a lot of the training on board, on shore.
I'd like to focus on your work history. We've just touched on it a little bit. Can you discuss your work as an engineer?
Sure. And perhaps we could go to the front page of my CV. At the bottom with my professional history. From 1980, when I graduated with my bachelor's degree, to 1989, I worked as an engineer. I worked for Westinghouse Electric Company, General Electric Corporations, and then 2 shipping lines on board for shipping, working on merchant ships. During that time period, I went through extensive training, probably close to 2 years of formal full-time training in nuclear operations, and included operating those Navy nuclear prototypes. I was involved with Westinghouse in teaching nuclear operations, where I specialized in nuclear disasters for power plants and how to react to those. And I worked in servicing power plants, nuclear power plants, and providing oversight to the services that Westinghouse delivered. So that was the focus of my career for the first decade.
Now, when I read the first paragraph of your report, you write, I am an economic consultant specializing in the electricity industry. First, what is an economic consultant?
Well, the short answer is an economist. I'm deferenced that I do not have a PhD, so I tend not to use that title, but it is providing any kind of consulting having to do with the field of economics. And I specialize virtually exclusively to things related to the electricity industry.
So you started your career as an engineer. Can you tell us about how you pivoted to economic consulting?
When I completed my Master of Science degree, I made a fundamental shift in my career to work in consulting, with the first firm being Putnam Hayes and Bartlett in 1989. Putnam Hayes and Bartlett is an economic consulting firm, and I've worked in that field ever since. I was hired by them with the background they do in the power plant operations. Economists play a heavy role in the electricity industry for a lot of reasons, but much more so than most industries. And having a deep technical background and how things really worked was very helpful and unusual to find in someone in my academic background.
And can you talk to us about the other firms, economic consulting firms that you've worked with?
Yeah. So from 1989 till present, I've worked with a number of firms, currently with Ancura, prior to that Navigant, then LECG, that was initially titled Law and Economics Consulting Group, and then Putnam Hayes, which I've mentioned. All of those were economic consulting firms. That's what they did. I took a 3-year diversion from that with Tesla Group, which was my own consulting firm, and JFG Associates, which was a small firm. And there for several years, I was involved with transactions in the power industry, helping companies find power plants for sale, negotiating for the acquisition of those, and other practical issues that were touched on economics, but were more transaction-based.
I see at the top of your CV, economic analysis for the electricity industry. And then right after, you have 2 paragraphs. Can you talk to us about your CV, outlining how you've organized it?
Yes, I've been a consultant for 30 plus years. And as a consultant, your CV is how you represent yourself to the industry. About 20 years ago, after my CV, which used to be a collection of individual projects, just got to be long and longer and longer, I summarized it with these paragraphs, and these paragraphs have virtually unchanged for 20 years, whether I'm dealing with litigation and testimony, which I do a fair amount of, or purely consulting engagements. But this is how I represent myself professionally. It is, as we've talked about, a economic analysis for the electricity industry. And then in the middle of the first paragraph, starting with areas of specialization, I list some of the more specific things that I get involved with.
Let's talk about those areas of specialization. Can you go over what they mean and also how you've worked in those areas?
Sure, and I will focus that not broadly, but on things that I think are most relevant here in this proceeding. The first item there is market design. I've been very involved with the structure of electricity markets. It turns out they are quite complicated. Between the US and Canada, there's at least 12 different market designs with different features and different structures. And I've been involved with working on those, including in Ontario, giving testimony and writing for trade publications, pushing for changes that I think will improve market design, all those kinds of things. I deal with competitive strategy, which is a broad term having to do with anything dealing with companies making decisions about how they want to, operate in the marketplace. The next item is power contracting. There are many long-term contracts for electricity. They bear some relationship to water rental agreements, which we'll get into in my testimony here. My work in power contract has included negotiating terms, but also testimony about how the contracts are structured, what are traditional practices, how contracts can be interpreted when circumstances that weren't anticipated have changed. A lot of times that'll go to litigation, and how do we handle the uncertain events that have occurred? I've done a lot of that kind of thing. I've done an investment analysis, looking at the value of generally power plants, but other aspects of the industry. The economic rents issues we will get into here are really investment analysis to a degree. There's a direct overlap between those two. I have analyzed power plants in lots of different circumstances. One of those that I think might be relevant is 20 years ago, I worked for Ontario Power Generation, was the provincial owner of the majority of the hydroelectric plants in Ontario, as well as other plants. And I did a complete portfolio analysis for the president of the company, looking at what things were worth, looking at how they would operate in a changing marketplace, looking at strategic decisions that they could consider, like the Beck Tunnel at Niagara Falls, which is a $1.5 billion project that was completed about 10 years ago. I was involved with all those things with Ontario Power Generation, and that's typical of work that I've done other places. The next item here is environmental strategy. I've done a lot of work with SO2, which is sulfur dioxide emissions and trading, and choices that might be made on how to manage that, and also with carbon dioxide and how rule changes can affect our ability to implement carbon dioxide reduction strategies in the industry. The next item is market power analysis. My work in Ontario started in the mid-90s doing market power analysis for Ontario Hydro. This is traditional work of economists in antitrust matters. There are regulatory issues in the US that require market power analyses for someone to be able to sell electricity. It also comes up as an antitrust issue when firms merge or buy and sell power plants, and I've worked in that world. And lastly, what I label market participant behavior, parentheses, manipulation. I don't know what to call this exactly, but firms get accused of manipulating electricity markets. And I've worked on behalf of firms defending what they've done and explaining what they've done to regulators. I've also worked with regulators themselves. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in the US has a provision that when they accuse someone and confirm someone's manipulated markets, where that entity can appeal that to federal court. And I was there, the witness of FERC, that agency, in the first cases that ever went to federal court to appeal, attempted to appeal the findings of manipulation, which they failed at court, but I was happy. It was a privilege to work for FERC in those matters.
So in all of these areas of specialization, you're providing economic consulting.
Yes,
So as you know, this case, and you've mentioned it, deals with economic rents. Have you completed work in that area?
yes, I am someone who has been involved with calculation of economic rents that were actually deployed in rules and charged as part of a process. Poorly worded sentence, but I've actually done it. It didn't occur to me until I've been working on this case for a while, but 30 years ago, early in my career, when I was working with Putnam, Hayes and Bartlett, they had been hired to calculate the economic rents on hydrochlorofluorocarbons, which are related to chlorofluorocarbons. These are CFCs or HCFCs, and people think of them as freon. They're used as aerosols. They're used as a coolant. They're used in industrial processes, and they destroy the ozone layer. So when those were phased out, the US government decided to phase them out over a number of years as part of an international treaty that was signed. And my firm, Putnam, Hayes and Bartlett, calculated the rents that could be charged so that the companies that were phasing these out, and the phase out caused a shortage and the price was expected to go up, we created a tax to try to capture those rents for the government rather than let them be a windfall for the firms that were manufacturing this product.
Can you talk to us about what clients you've had?
Sure. We can go down to the next paragraph. And I've worked with, there's a sentence there, perhaps we could get highlighted, his clients have included. And in my mind, these are all the aspects of different ways someone could look at the electricity industry. I've got vertically integrated electric utilities. Those are utilities that provide everything in terms of the electricity system, but also generating companies, which just have the power plants, load serving entities, which tend to just deliver the electricity to customers that are produced by other people. I've worked with regulatory agencies. I've mentioned the FERC. I've also worked with state regulatory agencies. I've worked with the Ontario Power Authority, which is, I guess, as I think about, it's not a regulatory agency. It's anyway, I've worked with other regulatory agencies. I've worked with fuel and pipeline companies, equipment suppliers. I mentioned a debt rating agency. When competitive electricity markets were introduced in the United States, Standard & Poor's for the first time had to rate debt on projects where the revenues were uncertain. We had to look at the market price for electricity. Up until this point, all the contracts were fixed. So they faced a new challenge of trying to understand the potential price changes. And I was their consultant for a multi-year period on, I don't know how many billions of dollars of debt that they rated to assess the price forecasts for those projects, which again is part of the valuation issues that come up with economic rents. But I did that for Standard & Poor's. Worked with a hedge fund. I've worked with the Department of Justices in both the United States and Canada. Some of the Department of Justice work in the United States concerned spent nuclear fuel and obligations and disputes over that among utilities and the US government. And I've done work here in Canada.
So you've worked with both private firms and governments.
Yes,
And for all these clients, you've provided economic consulting.
yes.
So you briefly touched on your work in Ontario, I think beginning in 1990. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. Ontario Hydro, which is the provincially owned entity that delivered power to municipalities in Ontario. They owned all the power plants. That's the electric utility of sorts, and I'll get into that in the actual testimony. They hired my firm to help them get access to US markets where there were requirements about opening up the markets and antitrust issues. And I supported someone initially as testimony was given in federal court. That was my entree, if you will, to Ontario Hydro. Soon after, Ontario went through a major restructuring program. And I became their consultant in setting up the rules for the market, their perspectives on the market design committee. There was a major issue with how we would handle market power for Ontario Hydro in the first few years. And there was I was integral to what was called the Market Power Mitigating Framework, which was a 4-year project of how Ontario Hydro would sell its electricity in a competitive environment, but not have Ontario Hydro open to the market forces, whether it's downside or windfalls that might come or higher prices that might come. So I was deeply involved as the economic consultant to Ontario Hydro during that process. My engagements in Ontario continued from there. Ontario Hydro broke apart as part of this restructuring. Ontario Power Generation took over their generating resources. I continued to work with them through this work. I did the portfolio analysis for the president of the company. That was a very intense 4 or 5 month project to look at all the resources and think about them in the new competitive environment. And I did other work. I did work for Hydro One, which is the entity that owns the power lines, and they had contracts to sell and help them work in the marketplace for the sale of those contracts. I worked for Ontario Power Authority. This was an independent authority that managed contracts. There was a dispute about things being built and force majeure provisions, and they brought me in to provide an economic insight to how to handle unique circumstance with that wind generator relative to the force majeure provision. That sounds like something that might be litigated, but it was not in a litigation context. They brought me as an independent person to assess it for them. And that my advice in that circumstance is what they deployed and how they resolved this contract dispute. So it was done outside of a judicial proceeding, but relying on my analysis. I've also worked with the Power Authority, the APRO, the Association of Power Producers of Ontario. These are all the power plant owners, includes Ontario Power Generation, but its really emphasis are the independents. And I've worked with them. I've given a number of speeches, but I've also worked on their behalf at least once before the regulator, the Energy Board in Ontario, having to do with tariffs that are charged between Canada and its neighbors. Principally, the US was the issue in that case. And I've worked on First Nation case here in Ontario.
Let's go to that First Nation case. I've counted 50 proceedings that you've been involved in. Can you tell us which First Nation case you're speaking about now?
Are you directing me to any page in his CV?
Your Honor, you can go to page 2. But I will let Mr. Hamill.
Yeah, it's at the bottom of page 2, on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen, is how the bullet starts, and it wraps over to page 3. My CV contains all the testimony that I've given, whether that's regulatory proceeding, formal court, arbitrations, etc. And I list, as I do here, who I work for, and cite the dates and the name of the title, and provide a brief overview, the briefest of overview of what I was involved with. This case was a dispute with the Lac Seul First Nations about hydroelectricity and values that came from that, and with respect to a treaty that had been signed. My job, my scope of work, was evaluating damages having to do with the benefits that were shared from those hydroelectric facilities. So the benefits were some sense of value, some sense of their framework of what profits might have been able to have been achieved. And there was a lot of issues with that. I'm greatly simplifying it, but that's what I did. I provided economic support for that analysis and expert testimony.
Sorry, so I'm starting on page 2, and Ms. Buggy, you said you counted so many cases, and are those cases set out starting here on page 2 and going to?
I can answer. The 50 that you mentioned do indeed start on at the top of page 2,
Yes.
and go for however 6, 7 pages, whatever it is. You can count those to get 50, I think.
So you were qualified as an expert in that proceeding?
Yes, I believe, yes, I gave testimony. I believe I was qualified. I don't remember the formalities of qualification, but yeah, I think so.
Thank you. And you mentioned you provided testimony on hydroelectricity and economics.
Yes.
Thank you. Going over to page 8, I see you have speeches and papers as the subtitle there. What topics have you written and presented on?
You know, this is a near complete list of the work that I've done. A lot of this has to do with market power and market structure. It's an area of particular interest of mine and one I think the industry needs help with. There is no clear answer. Economists may come in and say, oh, we just set the price and the price controls everything. Well, electricity is not like other products for reasons we could get into if we want to, but the actual mechanics matter and there's a lot of trade-offs that need to be made. And the mere fact there's 12 different ways that are attempted to do that today in Ontario, in Canada and the United States just gives you an idea of the kind of range of options there. And that's an area that I work on quite a bit.
So you've talked about your work in Ontario, just going back a little bit. Have you worked in other provinces?
Yes, I testified in Alberta on a case involving transmission access to Alberta from British Columbia, and then as a result of a brand new transmission line from Montana. And there are economic issues having to do with who gets those rights and who should pay what for them. And I testified in that case.
Mr. Hamill, you say you are an economic consultant. Do you ever call yourself an economist?
Usually, no. I've mentioned that I've given a lot of presentations, speeches to trade associations, that sort of thing. And several years ago, I was speaking in Toronto to the Association of Power Producers of Ontario, dealing with this issue about how we create incentives and the subtle issue that was involved. And on the spur of the moment, I introduced myself as a practical economist. And I found that that resonated with that particular crowd who has heard theoretical economists tell them how things should work and watch the markets continue to fail and change and evolve. And referencing myself as a practical economist really resonated with people who wanted to find something that worked. And I've done that since in that circumstance.
Your Honor, those are all my questions on qualifications. Ontario asks that Mr. Hamill is qualified as an expert as set out in Exhibit 55.
Thank you. Mr. Hamill will therefore be qualified to give opinion evidence to the on
Let's turn to the first section of your demonstratives discussing your assignment. Going over to slide number 3 now. Can you please take us through your understanding of the first question Ontario asked of you?
Right. So this slide presents in italics, word for word, what I was asked by Ontario in this case. I'll paraphrase, but it's to come up with the value in nominal dollars of the net NCRRs or net crown resource revenues. My focus is strictly on hydroelectric generation. I look only at those that are related to the treaty area and from 1850 to 2019. And I do that with deference to an understanding or deference to and consideration of the Court of Appeals rulings in this case. So it's to look at those revenues that are directly or closely related to the use, sale, and licensing of land, including the water rentals. I'm reading Part A and Part B. Look at the expenses related to collecting, regulating, and supporting those revenues.
And what was your conclusion for that first question?
I looked at a lot of analysis and a lot of background information about this, and then also considered Mr. Hutchings' report and his calculations of this, which were produced. And I concluded that his numbers are reasonable.
Numbers for,
Net Crown resource revenues,
thank you.
as derived from the water rental figures and the expense assumptions that he made. While reasonable, they aren't 100% correct. There are infirmities in the analysis. I did a lot of analysis before I saw his work, the nature of how this proceeding went. And I think it's worthwhile to spend some time to understand those infirmities. It's part of what I did in this case, but also I think there's some relevance to consideration of economic rents that we'll get into next.
Let's go to slide number 4 now. Can you please tell us your understanding of the second question Ontario asked you to provide an opinion on?
The second question concerns economic rents. Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings provided reports on that issue, and I was asked to review those reports, those issues, those positions they took with respect to the augmentation clauses, and then also with consideration of NCRRs, the Court of Appeals decision, all of that material, and again, strictly focused on hydroelectric generation. So in a nutshell, I looked at their work as it related to hydroelectricity and considered its relevance to this case. I want to make sure it's a delicate walk for me. I'm not offering legal opinions about relevance. I am trying to, as we discussed at the very beginning, assist the court with my understanding of this industry and these markets and try to frame it as I understand the issues are in this case.
So we'll get into this later in your testimony, but can you briefly discuss your conclusion on this second question?
The first issue is to acknowledge that economic rents are a well-established notional concept. I'm not disputing the concept itself. But when it comes to how they've been applied in this case, I find the calculations are deeply flawed. There's a lot of problems with the calculation of economic rents related to hydroelectricity that are presented in this case. The second thing I do is look at the conceptual value of economic rents as it's being applied. And I find major problems in how that has been framed as being relevant to the augmentation clause in this case, and relevant to the Court of Appeals decisions and other things. And as I do this, again, I'm walking that fine line between understanding the economics and then considering how that applies here.
Now, I noticed the word reliable. Can you tell us what you mean by that in the second sub-bullet?
Yeah, the first the calculated values are not reliable as they result from flawed calculations. What I mean by that is I find the flaws in those calculations so severe that even if one were to adopt the concept that is being put forth by Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings, that you can't use those analysis. They are off dramatically. Yeah.
Let's turn now to slide number 5.
And I'm just going to give you the advice I gave yesterday. Always wait for 2 B's and an answer.
Will do, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Going over to slide number 5. What materials is your opinion responding to? And can you tell us what materials you have reviewed in this matter?
I highlight at the start of this is presented on slide 5 of my demonstratives. The first 2 reports are the 2 that I have with me. We've talked about already the joint reports of Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings, their initial report and their reply report. I've also am replying to Mr. Hutchings' independent reports that he did solo authored in his initial and reply reports. So that's the main focus of what I'm concentrating on. It's not the limit of what I've looked at. I've reviewed the testimony and demonstratives of both the gentlemen as they were given in court. And I've also reviewed other material in this matter. That includes material from other experts and other material produced through the discovery process.
So we've already entered the reports you prepared for this matter as exhibits, but for clarity, can we refer to your first report as your initial report and your second report as your reply report?
Yes, I think that's appropriate. And you'll notice those are in subscript on this demonstratives. I use this slide to provide the shorthand reference that I'll use throughout these demonstratives to each of these documents.
Turning to slide number 6. Let's turn to section 2 of your demonstratives. Can you tell us what this next section speaks to?
This is all about net crown resource revenues. I mentioned earlier, Mr. Hutchings did an analysis and that I found his conclusions reasonable. This is where I discuss what I did to reach that conclusion.
Turning to slide number 7. Please explain how the electricity industry began and developed in Ontario.
Sure. Obviously, the treaty started in 1850 and electricity was not a thing in 1850. The start of the electricity industry is frequently referenced around 1882 with the construction of the Pearl Street station in New York City to power JP Morgan's light bulb in his office. It's a loose starting point, but it gives a framework for when things were started in this industry. It grew rapidly at the end of the 19th century with development many places, including modest-sized cities. But it didn't take a presence, and I start looking in this case in 1918 for the treaty areas. That's, if we look at the chart on this page and concentrate at the top line of that chart, I'm going to spend some time on that, using it to explain what happened in the industry in Ontario. There really was no generation in the treaty areas. There's a tiny bit that we could get into details, I think is not worth considering before 1918 in the treaty area. But this chart concerns the entire province. And you will see from 1918 up to around 1960, a growth of the industry, hydroelectricity in Ontario. It's important to note that virtually all the electricity in this time frame came from hydroelectricity. So what you're seeing is clearly electricity generation, but you're also seeing how the industry itself grew. You're seeing what consumers demanded of consumed. And then as it started to crest 1960, it grew much slower up till mid-80s and sort of plateaued out after that point. What we had done by the time we had 1985 or so is we had built hydroelectric facilities at all the locations that were reasonably cost effective. There's
So
still
when you say it grew much slower, all energy production or
hydro. Thank you. I meant hydro. What we're looking at is hydro. And so the growth you saw up till 1960 continued in terms of electricity demand, but we began using fossil fuels and then nuclear in Ontario.
after 1960?
After 1960, yeah, it started in the 60s. And it grew from there. Such that today, I believe Ontario is about 1/3 hydroelectric. And about 1/3 nuclear and 1/3 other things. There was a huge wave of coal generation that grew during the 70s and 80s and 90s. And then as a result of concerns of climate change, that's all been phased out. Wind generations come on, other dynamics that have taken place. But the plateau that you see in this chart comes from reasonably exhausting the cost-effective locations for hydroelectric generation in 1970 80, that time frame. There still are some minor projects that are being developed. There's no black and white on this, but that's generally what's happening here. So that's sort of hydroelectricity from a hardware standpoint. If I return to the bullets on the left-hand side, we can talk about the industry from a structural standpoint. The Ontario generation sector has been dominated by provincial entities for a long time. In 1906, the Power Commission Act set up Hydroelectric Power Commission of Ontario. I'll call that HEPCO, and I'll be using that a lot. This was a self-funded, not-for-profit provincial enterprise that was able to build power plants. It charged customers for that electricity to pay for it. It was entirely financed by debt. It was able to borrow at provincial rates, cheap provincial power, not as an independent power company, but as a province-owned enterprise. And that's what Ontario has used for a century in its electricity sector.
So what is it? It's a self-funded,
Profit,
enterprise.
provincially, with a board of directors appointed by the province. And it owns all the power plants. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, it owns the power plants. It owns the transmission grid that moves power throughout the system. It serves some customers. It turns out not a lot of customers. Ontario uniquely has many municipalities like Dominion Power. I don't know what Sudbury does. Without knowing for as a fact, what I know of Ontario makes me certain that Sudbury has its own municipal distribution system. And there's 60 or 70 of them across the province. And so it's the wholesale provider of electricity for the most part. And when we talk about hydroelectricity, we're talking about the generation side, not distribution to customers. I mean, it plays a role, but the focus here really comes down to issues that HEPCO is involved with. So that was established in 1906. In 1973, the Power Commission Corporation Act created Ontario Hydro, and Ontario Hydro took over from HEPCO. For the issues in this case, the only factor that I think is at all relevant is now we have to give a new name to the same thing. There are other issues that come up, but it really was structured and operated the same way. I think they are almost interchangeable in terms of the names. And it is my practice here is to try to use the right name when we're talking about a specific time period, but to not let that get in the way of speaking with clarity of what's going on. So if we really,
Ontario Hydro is the successor to HEPCO
yeah, absolutely, yes.
from 1937.
1973. And then in 1998, we had the Electricity Act. And this caused a major restructuring of the electricity industry. I'm going to start at the end. The end is for reasons that I haven't broached at all. We don't have to pay much attention to this here. This turns out not to matter much, but as a matter of understanding the industry, just as general background, Ontario Hydro ceased to exist after implementation of this act. There were 5 enterprises that took over its functions. Ontario Power Generation took over the power plants. Hydro One took over the transmissions grid. The independent system operator, which has changed its name several times, took over the operation of the marketplace and the control of the system without owning major pieces of it. There was a finance corporation to deal with debt. There was another entity to handle some ancillary issues. All of that took place. The structure of the market changed fundamentally and trying to create more competitive market. That all took place. So from a hydro standpoint, hydroelectricity standpoint, OPG took over where Ontario Hydro had existed before. So this happened. If you look at the chart, I've broken this chart up into 4 different periods, and I'll explain why later. But, you know, working from the left, the first 3 show dark green and gray. The dark green are the HEPCO and Ontario Hydro. Those are the provincial hydroelectric facilities. And that's the vast majority. In the middle periods from 1960 up until 2000, HEPCO was 91.2% of all the generation. And so the other non-HEPCO, which were for-profit companies, were 8.8%, or I'll round that to 9% of the generation. In the early years, the non-HEPCO share was higher. A lot depends on how you calculate this number. Calculate it one way, it's 25%. You could, if you just eyeball the dark green versus the gray, you'll see get a feel for a higher percentage. That number doesn't matter specifically, but that's how the nature of this industry evolved in Ontario. So it's mostly provincial, except there, you know, a not insignificant amount of HEPCO, non-HEPCO generation that we pay attention to.
Now, you use the word industry. But for our purposes, you're talking
Hydroelectric generation, yes. Yes. On the right-hand side, it's a grayer green. I do not have the split between the provincial-owned hydroelectric versus the non-provincial. I'm sure it's very similar to what occurred before. Again, it doesn't matter. Data is not readily available and it's unimportant, so it's not broken out on this chart. But the total is there, total amount of hydroelectricity.
I'm just going back to something. What is the 25%? 25% is provincial generation.
No, that's the non-HEPCO,
Or sorry, is the non.
yeah,
75% is.
right.
Thank you.
But that number really is, if you look at the percentage each year, what percent is hydro, HEPCO, and what percent is not, you would get a number in each year. And in the early years, say 1928 on the chart, you can see that, gee, the non-HEPCO gray bar is maybe a third. It's pretty significant. 1928, the total generation I'm estimating at 6,000. And so the gray area is about a third of it, and that weights heavily in the 25% figure that's presented at the top of the chart, because I average each year. So that year weighs equally to 1958, where the total is 32,000 and the HEPCO version is maybe 29,000. So it's 90% by that time, HEPCO. But I weigh both of those years equally in coming up with a number. This isn't important, but it does give a feel for, in current years, the non-HEPCO version is pretty stable around 9%, and earlier it was higher. And that's the real message, and I don't think the numbers are going to matter. Just to complete this slide, the reason I break apart these 4 different time periods has to do with water rentals. We haven't talked about it yet, but there are issues with the water rentals themselves, which is why I've broken apart for consideration these 4 different periods.
We talked about HEPCO owning power plants. Why would the province build new hydroelectric generators?
Well, they build them to meet demand. Electricity might be the defining element of a modern society. And different approaches are taken to get power plants built. And as a result of the 1906 Power Commission Act, Ontario committed to having Ontario HEPCO be the entity that made sure that power plants got built as customers demanded more electricity. So it's really a demand-driven construction. We built as needed. You don't build them. There's no market for generation you can't consume. There's no way to store electricity. There's no way to put it in a box and ship it to some other place. So you built it as you needed it.
Turning now to slide number 8. Can you tell us about provincial water rental revenues?
Right. So the NCRRs, and I'm hoping that's an okay acronym to use here at this point, that Mr. Hutchings came up with had to do with water rental revenues, the water rents. And there is records of those, and this presented on table 8 are the yearly province-wide water rental revenues for each year from 1918 to 2019. These numbers come largely from the public accounts of Ontario. Under the direction of this court in 2021, Mr. Hutchings and I got engaged in some conversations to understand the data and to understand our sources. We met and resolved some minor issues with respect to this data and reached an agreement as these figures we would both work from as what the province-wide water rentals were. After that, just as there's a sub note here, it was found that there was a slight difference between what we had used and what actually was recorded in 1995. I think we missed that as a mistake. My understanding is Professors Broadway and Smart used the corrected number. And so I just make note of that here. I don't think it's significant, but just for clarity, I make that note. But with the province-wide water rentals, what we need, and therefore what remains of this issue, is figuring out what portion of those are fairly attributed to the treaty area.
And these province-wide water rental revenues I see from your first bullet come from the public accounts of Ontario.
Yes.
And why would water rental revenues fluctuate from one year to the next?
They could fluctuate because the rates charged changed, but that's rarely happened. Mostly it's because of the more demand by customers. These things are a function in one way or another of electricity that's generated. We generate when customers need electricity. And so that's what causes the variation here. That's true from 1918 up till 1970 or so. Over time, as we began to use all the hydroelectric we had and then built fossil stations and later nuclear stations to provide the extra needed, the hydroelectric facilities basically ran as much as they could. So their output would vary based on rainfall. So rainfall explains the variation in the last 10 years, and rainfall doesn't explain any variation in the first 10 years. It's because the last 10 years you would use all that you could reasonably. In the earlier years, you just used what you needed to meet demand.
Turning now to slide number 9. What can you tell us about the locations of treaty area facilities?
The determination of which facility was in the treaty area, I think for hydroelectricity is particularly easy, frankly. I came up with the list and worked off of Dr. Werner on Gurnet's provisional determination in my initial report. Later, there was the parties agreed to what that treaty area would be, is my understanding. And when I looked at the updated definition of that, it didn't change any hydroelectric facility. Hydroelectric facilities are placed where there are rivers. And most of the treaty area, as I understand it, is defined by watersheds or points where water will flow one way versus the other. And that's the last place you would ever build a hydroelectric facility, because there's no water there. There's no concentration of hydro. And I think that made it relatively easy for this particular source of revenues. Each facility has a river associated with it. Rivers are easy to find on a map. That's what I used. They don't change, they don't move. Once a hydroelectric facility is built, it has continued operation. I don't believe there are any hydroelectric facilities in Ontario that have shut down. That might be wrong, but there certainly aren't many, and I don't think there are any in the treaty area. And the designations that I came up with matched Mr. Hutchings and also the Ministry of Finance. I'll get into later how they did work in this area with their own determination for some of the water rental determinations that we'll cover. But locations was not an issue.
And
Whenever you would like, Your Honor. We can do it right now.
All right. Colton, I was you may be seated.
Mr. Hamel, before the break, we spoke about history, provincial water rental revenues, and the locations of treaty area facilities. Let's turn now to slide number 10. Can you talk to us about 1918 to 2000, and what can you tell us about the water rental revenues for this period in the Superior Treaty area?
Sure. And I will start by, as I've mentioned earlier, I have accepted or find reasonable Mr. Hutchings' approach for the figures. This is his analysis that I'm going to go into here. We have good information for 2001 and beyond. So this really is the focus of the review, frankly. In order to dive into the details, I need to define the term energy and draw a contrast between energy and capacity. I've worked in this industry for a very long time and had talked to people who are new to it, and they can get tripped up over the difference between these two. Fortunately, it's not going to make much difference here. It's not something that any analysis needs to depend on this understanding. It's just important to know that they're different. So that's just an overview to give some perspective on what we need to take away. Energy is the megawatt hours of electricity that is either generated or consumed. It's a quantity of electricity that you can consume. Capacity is the ability to generate. And so I can look at a hydroelectric facility, and if I look at the label on the generator, that piece of equipment, it tells me what its capacity is. What is that piece of equipment capable of doing? To know how much energy it produces, I need to look at how much water there is and how much water will flow down. So the capacity won't change if there's no rain at all. If the river runs dry, that unit is still capable of doing the same thing, and we could know that. But to know how much electricity is generated, well, now we look at the water and it's flowing and it's consumed. And I find a useful analogy, not 100% accurate, but helps people get a feel for this, is in an automobile. If you look at the amount of gasoline in the tank, that gives you an idea of how much energy it has, how much ability it has to go forward, how far it could get. If I look under the hood, I can see its horsepower rating. That tells you about how much capacity it has to produce, how much, how powerful it is. But one without the other doesn't tell you the whole story. And the capacity rating is the same, just like the horsepower rating of an engine is the same, whether they have gasoline or not. But the energy, which is what we typically measure here, is how much is produced.
And when you say capacity, do you usually mean capacity rating?
Yes,
Thank you.
yes. Yes. All right, with that as background, what Mr. Hutchings did is he figured out he estimated the treaty area water rental revenues by basing it on its share of its energy production. He looked, and there was data issues to deal with, but his overview was he would look at how much energy was produced in the treaty area versus the total province, to take that percentage in each year and say that's the percentage of water rentals that are attributed to the treaty area. That's what he did. There are some technical issues that I detailed here and go into more depth about. We had a lot of good information on HEPCO up through 1966, and then the smaller units aren't available up till 92. There's basically no data from 92 to 2000, just coincidentally, sort of very much a surprise, but it's a fact. There isn't data about energy production by individual stations or hydroelectric dams in the 93 to 2000 time period. The non-HEPCO generators, there's not good energy data available in this for any of this time period from 1918 to 2000. So this was a challenge Mr. Hutchings had in his application. What he did, where he didn't have the energy information, is looked at the capacity information for those generators and then used the treaty area capacity share to allocate the unallocatable energy water rentals. So just to make sure this is to restate this in sort of a different way to make this understandable, perhaps, is we might have good data on 90% of everything. And so
We might have, or we do.
I am drawing a
Oh.
a simplified version to get the ideas across.
Mhm.
And if we have 90% energy data, he would allocate that on the basis of what was in the treaty area, consistent with his approach. For the 10%, he knows the 10%, but we don't know how much was in the treaty area. But he knows the capacity of all the generators that we don't have energy data on. And so of those, he takes that 10% of energy and allocates that based on what percentage is in the treaty area.
And do you agree with that approach?
I think that's a reasonable thing to do with the approach he had. There are issues here, but having adopted the energy approach, that's a reasonable way to do it.
Thank you.
And later I will circle back to talk about what I did to verify that conclusion that it's reasonable. But it's reasonable. So we're not making a distinction about that. The one difference I mentioned before was his dealing with 93 to 2000. In that period of time, he had no energy data that would allow him to distinguish between treaty area and non-treaty area. And he did something different for that period. It's only 7-8 years, but he did something different. What he did is he looked at the 5 years before this time period and the 5 years after this time period. He calculated the average value of the treaty area for each of those, the before and after. And then he interpolated over this time period. Just an overview of interpolation. When you have a number before and a number after, and they're different, you assume they grow in a constant amount to go from the before version to the after version. And that's what he did. I could go over that in other ways if it's helpful, but he interpolated over this time period.
What do you think about that interpolation method, Mr. Hamill?
In general, it's a very effective, common, useful way to deal with missing data. There is a problem here in that the basic assumption is that what happened before and after the missing time period data is our best guess is what's going on, that we would expect it to be between the two. Problem in applying it here is that the after period, 2001 and beyond, we had a fundamental change in water rental structure in the industry. And so it's not reasonable to think that the 1999 period is very close to the 2001 period, because there was a sharp change in how water rentals were determined in between those two. So I think that a simple interpolation is missing the foundational assumption. Mr. Hutchins doesn't talk about that at all. But I don't think it introduces a major error here. So the overall reasonableness of this, I've accepted that. And I'm going to pause a minute and sort of go back to what I've just laid out as Mr. Hutchins' approach. And the next step, I'm going to talk more about the details of how rentals really occur in Ontario. Mr. Hutchins doesn't present a why he did it this way. He doesn't justify this approach. He doesn't deal with whether or not interpolation is reasonable or not, given the underlying facts in the case. He says, here's the approach. I allocate it on the basis of energy. He doesn't discuss water rental agreements at all. He just does that. And so we don't have his perspective on why he thought that was reasonable in more detail.
Let's turn now to slide number 11 and talk about what you just mentioned, water rental agreements. So how do water rental payments work? How do we determine who pays what? What are they?
So when I became engaged in this case and understood water rentals were important, I did as deep a dive as I could into water rental agreements, which are the foundations of how water rentals are paid. And I went out of my way, did repeated requests to get as much information as we could about the water rental agreements. Every station in Ontario is covered by its own water rental agreement up through 2000. Again, we have the 2000 to 2001 breakpoint I keep talking about. But everyone had their own unique agreement with some detail I'll go into here. HEPCO agreements were restructured in 1960 and 1985. The next slide is all about that. So it's an important shift that took place. I'll get into that on the next slide. But if I look at the major bullets on this slide, the first bullet is every facility had its own agreement. The second is I reviewed all the agreements, and this is detail about how messy it was to try to understand those agreements. I could not match up the agreements with all the known facilities. We clearly had an incomplete set and could not complete that set. It was complicated by the fact that agreements tend to be put in place before construction. Dates aren't identified. Names are often changed. So you'll have a water rental agreement with a developer of a power plant, but you don't know which power plant was actually built and what they named it later. The timing of these things could vary. Some were short periods, some were long periods. We didn't see renewals. Quite often it was particularly a gap in the analysis. And obviously we're dealing with many, many decades here. So there was a real problem in getting that. Now, having said that, having looked at a lot of water rental agreements, I get a sense of what's in them. And there is variation in the water rates. These rates are charged often in the early years in $1 per average horsepower. And for clarity, that's unusual units, but that isn't measure of energy. I've talked about energy and capacity, and a lot of the early agreements were in terms of energy, but they had different rates. Mr. Hutchins allocating on the basis of energy, the implied assumption is all generators are paying the same rate, and clearly that's not true. Now, some were as low as 50 cents, some as high as $2 over this time period. And there was variation. There were also times where there were minimum payments, regardless of how much was generated. So that's clearly payments that are not tied to energy production at all. There are other agreements that had tax holidays, and I call them tax holidays. They were often called that in the agreements, but zero payment for a number of years. And so, no payment means that allocated on the basis of energy causes error in the analysis at that point as well. And then the durations were varied dramatically. I noted here because I found it so surprising. One agreement in Ontario literally goes for 999 years. It's not in the treaty area, but I found it just sort of surprising. Some were 10, 20 years. Some had preset renewal term dates. Some did not. It's really quite a mess. And I'll go into how I dealt with the variation that was here, but I tried to figure out, or at least come up with a conceptual idea of why there might be such variation. I mean, the needs of the Crown to collect revenues from water would seem to me to be somewhat constant and ever present. And the only reason I could come up with, I can't verify this with facts, but conceptually, the only reason I see is that the unique attributes of each project influenced how much they would pay. So a highly valuable water resource would pay more than one that was more marginal and might not have been built if the rates were higher. This plays a role as we discuss economic rents in the next section, and the idea that it's the same for all units. Again, that's what I see as the reason that makes sense to me and why there must be so much variation.
Let's turn now to slide number 12. I recall you mentioning restructuring and how you were involved in that in Ontario. Can you tell us what is restructuring?
Yeah, I consider restructuring anytime there's a fundamental change in agreements or structure of the industry or anything else. Let me be clear, the restructuring I did had to do with the electricity market, was not related to water rental agreement restructuring, which is on this page. So I was not involved with changing water rental rates or specifically. But as I look at this page 12, on the right-hand side, I have two charts. And in the first chart in blue is the water rental province-wide water rentals. And these numbers are actually in the table that was presented earlier. I find it helpful to look at it as a graph. So this is just a plotting of those numbers. And you could see it changes different than the energy production. I mean, the reason it changes, number one, because we have the amount of water, hydroelectricity that's generated.
When you say changes, it's different than the green graph.
Yes.
Got it.
Yes, the shape's different things going on there. What I did in the chart below was to put this in nominal, put this in today's dollars. Now, I'm not offering opinion on how that might be done. I found it really sort of some level of that needed to be able to look at this data better. I chose the Canadian long-term bond rates. This is one rate that's being used in this case by Professor Bodway and Smart. I offer no opinion of whether that's the right rate to use, but I think we can see things in the chart, whether we use that rate, and the lessons that are learned would be the same for any other rate. I'm obviously drawing a bright line here that I'm not offering an opinion about those rates. But when you do that, you see some things in the red chart, because that's what we have going on here. And you see, in particular, a dramatic change in 1960 and 1985. And the words on this chart get into the reasons why, but there's a fundamental shift that happened on those dates. And you can see how they match up with the vertical lines I drew on the earlier graphs to separate these different time periods. And we'll get into that. I will also note in these charts, the darker color, whether we're blue or red, those are the treaty area water rentals in nominal and present value terms. It's just plotted there for completeness. But looking at this data, we can see that in terms of nominal dollars, especially, the majority of the water rentals are in this period, which we haven't talked about at all, where there's a lot of certainty. And the earlier periods, especially the first period up to 1960, even in nominal terms, is pretty small. So now turning to the bullets here, I want to talk about restructuring of water rental agreements with HEPCO. Again, HEPCO, 91% of the generation, they are provincially owned. They're independent. They're independent with a board of directors appointed by the Crown. And they changed their rates and set them on a uniform basis for all their facilities in 1960 at $1.35 for average horsepower. So we see one agreement, cover all their units and deal with them on a uniform basis for the first time. We also have the rate increase with inflation for the first time. All the other agreements that I've seen were constant over the time. And so now we go to the charts, the red one's easier to see. You see that obviously the inflation is minimal between 1959 and 1960. It's just 1 year is different. That jump that occurs for province-wide revenues is entirely the result of the rate change for the HEPCO unit that went into that agreement. So that's what caused that rise to occur. In 1985, there was another change in the agreement with HEPCO, and it caused the rates to jump up again. And that is also entirely due to HEPCO's payment that now Ontario Hydro, but it's because of their agreement, which is what that caused that to jump up. To flesh this out, I looked closely for non-HEPCO stations. They're independent companies. And so one can't just change existing agreements like you could with HEPCO. And so I saw memos and background information that were looking at the idea of what might be done with those agreements. I'm sure changes were made when they came up for renewal, but there was not a industry-wide, province-wide step change for the non-HEPCO units.
In 01
And then, so now we
or
come.
anytime?
It's a great question. Timing's perfect. There was a change in 01. As a result of legislation in 01, all water agreements were set on the same rate for everyone. And so, and I will get into this later, but HEPCO, non-HEPCO, for the first time ever, were put on the same terms with a constant rate. And it was done through legislation, which is, I presume, how you get around the existing agreement timing. And it also, it came through as gross revenue charge. It came with the tax authorities. Access to those numbers was readily available. And I'll talk about that later.
You just mentioned gross revenue charge. Can you just tell us what that is?
I don't want to give a legal definition to it, but that's how they were charged. That's what the water rental was. It came through the tax authority in some way, and they call it a gross revenue charge. And it's specific for water rentals.
So on this slide, when we see major restructurings, you're referring to 1960, 1985, and 2001 as being those important major years.
Right, and they correspond to the vertical lines on the charts.
Let's turn now to slide number 13. What can you tell us about this slide?
Well, now I want to pull together two things. I talked about what Mr. Hutchins did, and then I talked about what I understand how the industry really worked. Mr. Hutchins didn't reference anything about how the industry worked or agreements, but I had this as background, and I was faced with how to reconcile these two and what to do about it. Clearly, the water rental rates are not uniform
Until 2001.
until 2001. I actually think can we go back a slide? It just occurred to me I missed something. In the second sub bullet concerning 1985, they set rates for HEPCO, then Ontario Hydro, based on an energy charge and a capacity charge. These are these two elements that I've mentioned a couple of times now. And as a result of choices made by the province, they decided to charge, about half the revenue came in from energy and half came from capacity. And so this is just part of the moving tapestry of water rentals in Ontario, and it shows the simplification Mr. Hutchings put in of always using energy just doesn't reflect what was going on. And so as I return to page 13, that's part of what we have. We have all these reasons why purely allocating the basis of energy doesn't match with the underlying industry.
But at the end of the day, you still agree.
I think it's reasonable, yeah.
with my reason.
So it's what I look for is try to find patterns of these differences, that frankly would say, is the RST charging more or charging less? I don't see any indication that there was concern of the RST as a treaty area per se. But if I looked at that part of Ontario, is there any reason that it would be higher or lower? And I didn't see that. And I've got more on that here as we go forward. So there is this error, there's this inconsistency on that time period. I'll return to that in my summary slide, but perhaps we can go on.
If you can talk to us about what you mean here about energy production is incorrect.
Pardon me?
You note here on slide 13, energy production is incorrect.
Yeah, the allocation on the basis of energy doesn't reflect how these agreements were really structured. So there's error, there is error there for sure.
And on that last bullet point, you have, I found no pattern. What pattern, when you say you found no patterns, how did you come to that conclusion?
I explored this every way I could. I had all the data. I looked for patterns. I looked for whether this capacity versus energy difference could likely over or underestimate in the RST region. I looked for whether the HEPCO versus non-HEPCO difference could result in over or under correction. If you notice in my footnote on the last bullet, I referenced paragraphs 55 to 102. That's 50 pages, 50 paragraphs of analysis looking for these kinds of things, which it's not my plan to go through here, but it was my attempt to try to be thorough in understanding this. And at the end of the day, I did not find a pattern that would indicate that this would throw things off in a material way.
Let's turn to slide number 14. So we've just talked about water rental revenues, allocating them to the Robinson Superior Treaty area from 1918 to 2000. Can you walk us through 2001 to 2019?
Finally, I've been mentioning it several times. The Ministry of Finance used confidential tax revenue figures and data to determine the treaty area water rentals from 2001 to 2019. They had actual data of what each one of these facilities contributed and how much they paid each year. They presented those numbers. There's an issue of confidentiality here, which complicated this process, but they provided me with redacted versions of tax records to protect names. Obviously, tax issues are confidential, but we went through a process of figuring which facilities they were including, and then getting the data on those facilities and then matching up and auditing the numbers that they came up with. And at the end of the day, we came up with what those revenues are. I don't consider them estimates. I think these are the numbers. And so as a result of this, all these prior issues about restructuring and Ontario Power Generation and capacity versus energy just don't matter anymore. We have the actual numbers for this 20-year period.
And does this,
And Mr. Hutchings accepted these in his analysis as well.
does this period give you any insight into prior periods?
Yes, it does. If you look on the right-hand chart, you'll see the actual numbers. I presented the RST number dollars and the Ontario dollars for water rentals, and I've calculated the RST share. And over this 20-year period, the RST share was about 10.3%. There's also surprising variation from year to year. We're in a time period where there's a lot of non-hydroelectric generation that's being used. And so hydroelectric facilities are being used to their maximum. We're using all the water that comes down the river. And the variation that occurs, I believe, is entirely due to rainfall distribution. And obviously we have wet years and dry years, and this area of Ontario could be different than other areas. And that's why I think the share shifts from going down the top of the list from 8.7%, 14% to 7% to 13%. That kind of variation is a result of rainfall.
When you say rainfall, you're using that as either shorthand or an explanation for flows?
Yes, rainfall turns into the amount of water that goes through the dam. Yes. So
Just wondering if snow melt ever.
Thank
It's just a thing we in Northern Ontario talk about when we talk about rivers.
I stand embarrassed and corrected. Yes, precipitation. And a related issue, since you mentioned it, I said all the water gets used. It turns out in Ontario, especially the northern parts of Ontario, there's a period of time in the hydroelectric world called freshet. I don't know if that term is used routinely colloquially, but freshet is that time of year when everything melts and it can come down the rivers.
It's about now.
Yeah. And they don't use all of it, and they spill. They don't need the electricity, and their water's got to go. So that it's designed so that it goes around the hydroelectric generator and flows out the river.
And my other question is, when you use the words, the data shows, or the chart shows that about 10.3% of the water rental revenues can be attributed to the treaty area. You're talking about looking at Ontario as a whole, looking at the RST number and saying that's 10% of the revenue.
Right.
Got it.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's we have this figure on page 14 is pretty solid. We know all those numbers. We've laid them all out and described it. And where I was headed then is to look at that 10.3%. That's pretty close to what we had in all the prior years. So Mr. Hutchings had his own approach to determining how much was from the RST region. And for all those years and all his analysis, it falls very close to this range. And if you look at the amount of variation that does occur, well within the variation that you see in a year-by-year basis. So it's sort of those numbers don't have to match up, but for me personally, not that it proves anything, but it was some comfort to say we're in the ballpark because it makes sense.
Turning now to slide number 15. We just spoke about revenues from 1918 to 2019. What about expenses?
Okay, so and we're now talking about the entire period, which you may have just said, but the entire span. Mr. Hutchings, and I quote him here, it's not possible to identify specific expenses. He allocates 2% of revenues as expenses, and he sees the only relevant expense are collections of the revenue charges. And he has a basis of coming up with 2% as a measure of what that might be. That's what he did. I think there are some expenses in Ontario, the early surveys of hydroelectricity, et cetera. But I also believe there's strong reason to believe that Crown expenses for the hydroelectric sector are quite modest. Backing up what we've already talked about, the Crown set up HEPCO to stand alone, not-for-profit, self-funded enterprise to get the electricity generated. And it could collect the revenues it needed by charging for the electricity it produced. And so this self-funding enterprise didn't need a lot of support. And it doesn't show up directly in public accounts as support for hydroelectric. I was also concerned that as we look at infrastructure that might be needed to support hydro, it might overlap with expenses that are related to mining or timber or something else, and I didn't want to double count. So I concluded that this is not an unreasonable assumption, and I don't present any other figures for that.
So Hutchings' assumption of 2% you accept as reasonable.
Yeah, I would go not unreasonable, split hairs, but it amounts to the same thing. That's what I do.
That's what you do, okay.
Okay, slide number 16. Mr. Hamel, what are your conclusions with respect to water rental revenues and expenses collected by the Crown from 1918 to 2019?
On this chart, those are the same figures that we saw earlier. I just found it useful in case we want to talk about this in depth. But I think Mr. Hutchins' approach from 1918 to 2000 is not correct, but doesn't appear to substantially overestimate or underestimate the actual revenues. I think the uncertainties are the greatest in the earliest years, and I think there's essentially no uncertainty for the last 20 years. I think those figures are reasonable for determining the RST area net Crown resource revenues. And I will say that part of my conclusion is under the direction of the court, Mr. Hutchins and I corresponded about the province-wide numbers. I saw in that a desire to try to not get bogged down in minor details, and that influenced me in concluding that these were reasonable numbers to work with, so that this court has other things it can focus on. I think the 2% assumption about expenses is not unreasonable.
Your Honor, those are my questions for the first two sections of Mr. Hamel's demonstratives. I think we have 15 minutes left to 1 p.m. So I can pass things over to my colleague, Mr. Hong, to take Mr. Hamel through the next sections, or we can go for a lunch break now, whatever we're happy with.
Okay, thank you. What's your preference, sir?
I think this is the most natural break point for the presentation, so
All right,
this is
for
probably
lunch?
the best time for lunch.
Okay. Well, I'll just ask then Mr. Hamel to give me your most succinct conclusion. That is that Mr. Hutchings' conclusions are either, some of them, reasonable or not unreasonable.
Reasonable.
Bottom line?
Bottom line,
Or-
reasonable. With respect to what we're talking about here, reasonable. Overall, it's reasonable.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll take the lunch break then. What's your? Take lunch break, and we're on.
Okay.
What's your preference?
Yeah, in having